The morning fog clung to Whitmore Air Force Base like a shroud, thick enough that Captain Sarah Chen could barely make out the silhouette of the control tower from her office window. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching maintenance crews emerge and vanish again in the gray mist like phantoms going about their morning routines. The coffee in her mug had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she hadn't noticed. Her attention was fixed on something else entirely. Something that made her stomach twist with a familiar ache she'd carried for 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Across the tarmac, barely visible through the fog, sat Hangar Delta 7. Inside that hangar waited an F-22 Raptor that hadn't flown a single mission since Captain Rebecca Martinez had vanished over the Arctic Ocean during what should have been a routine training exercise. The aircraft remained in perfect condition, maintained weekly by a ground crew that asked fewer and fewer questions about why they were servicing a fighter jet that had no assigned pilot. Sarah had been Rebecca's closest friend at Whitmore, the kind of friendship forged in the crucible of flight school and strengthened through countless hours of shared missions. They'd pushed each other to excel, covered for each other's mistakes, and developed the kind of trust that only existed between pilots who had saved each other's lives. When Rebecca disappeared, something fundamental had broken in Sarah's world. A crack that 3 years of promotions and commendations hadn't managed to heal. The official incident report lay buried somewhere in classified Pentagon files, but Sarah remembered every detail with crystalline clarity. October 15th, 3 years ago. Rebecca had been leading a formation of 6 F-22s on a standard navigation training mission over the Beaufort Sea, north of Alaska. Weather conditions were marginal, but within acceptable parameters. Visibility was good. Radio communications were clear. Then, at exactly 1,432 hours Zulu time, Rebecca's aircraft had simply vanished from radar. No distress signal. No mayday call. No debris field ever located, despite weeks of intensive search and rescue operations involving the Coast Guard, Navy, and Canadian forces. One moment she was there, her voice calm and professional as she reported their position to air traffic control. The next moment, the sky was empty except for 5 other Raptors flying in a formation that suddenly felt incomplete. Sarah had been flying as Rebecca's wingman that day, positioned close enough to see the subtle adjustments Rebecca made to her flight controls, the way she tilted her head slightly when concentrating on navigation calculations. They had been discussing dinner plans over the secure radio channel, debating whether the base mess hall's Friday night special was worth enduring or if they should drive into town for real food. Normal conversation between friends who expected to land safely and continue their lives as planned. When Rebecca's radar signature disappeared, Sarah's first reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Equipment malfunctions happened. Radio failures occurred. She called out over the secure channel, expecting to hear Rebecca's voice crackling back with some wry comment about temperamental avionics. Instead, she heard only static that seemed to stretch on forever. The search had consumed 18 days. Sarah had flown every authorized mission, pushing her aircraft to its operational limits as she scoured thousands of square miles of Arctic wilderness. She'd studied satellite imagery until her eyes burned, analyzed weather patterns, and consulted with survival experts about hypothetical scenarios where a downed pilot might survive in sub-zero temperatures. The official conclusion was pilot error, leading to controlled flight into terrain, though no wreckage was ever found to support that theory. Sarah knew better. Rebecca Martinez had been one of the finest pilots to graduate from the Air Force Academy in the past decade. She could thread an F-22 through turbulence that would ground commercial aircraft, navigate by dead reckoning when GPS systems failed, and land on improvised runways that existed only in emergency protocols. The idea that she would simply fly into a mountainside was absurd to anyone who had seen her handle an aircraft, but the Air Force needed explanations that fit within acceptable parameters. Pilot error was comprehensible, documentable, and didn't require investigating phenomena that might prove embarrassing or classified. So Rebecca Martinez became another statistic, another name added to the memorial wall, another reminder that military aviation remained inherently dangerous despite technological advances. The memorial service had been held at Arlington National Cemetery on a gray November morning that matched Sarah's mood perfectly. She'd stood at attention while chaplains read prayers and officers delivered speeches about sacrifice and service. The flag presentation to Rebecca's mother had been handled with military precision, each fold executed flawlessly by honor guards who had performed the ceremony hundreds of times before. But Sarah remembered thinking that the folded flag felt like a placeholder, a symbol representing someone who might still be alive somewhere in the vast Arctic wilderness. Rebecca's personal effects had been boxed and shipped to her family in New Mexico. Her quarters had been cleaned and prepared for the next officer rotation. Her name had been added to the base memorial alongside pilots who had died in training accidents, combat operations, and aircraft malfunctions dating back to World War II. The administrative process of erasing someone from active duty had been completed with bureaucratic efficiency that left no room for sentiment or doubt. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing from the official narrative. Rebecca had been working on a project in the weeks before her disappearance, something involving high-altitude reconnaissance protocols that she'd been reluctant to discuss in detail. She'd been staying late in her office, reviewing classified materials and making notes in a leather-bound journal that had never been found among her personal effects. When Sarah had asked about the extra hours, Rebecca had deflected with jokes about ambitious career officers and their obsession with advancement. The project, whatever it was, had apparently died with Rebecca. Colonel James Patterson, the base commander, had mentioned during the investigation that all classified materials related to Rebecca's work had been transferred to higher authorities for review. Sarah had never heard any follow-up about conclusions or recommendations stemming from that review. It was as if Rebecca's final assignment had been classified into oblivion along with her memory. Sarah's own career had continued on its expected trajectory, despite the emotional turmoil of losing her best friend. She'd been promoted to captain ahead of schedule, recognized for exceptional performance during joint training exercises with NATO allies, and selected for advanced tactical training that positioned her for eventual command responsibilities. Her efficiency reports consistently rated her as one of the most promising officers in her squadron, someone destined for significant leadership roles within the Air Force structure. But success felt hollow when achieved without the person who had motivated Sarah to excel in the first place. Rebecca had possessed an infectious enthusiasm for flying that made even routine training missions feel like adventures worth pursuing. She'd pushed Sarah to take calculated risks, to trust her instincts when instruments provided conflicting information, and to view each flight as an opportunity to improve rather than simply complete assigned tasks. Without that influence, Sarah found herself going through the motions of a career that no longer held the same meaning. The other pilots in her squadron respected Sarah's skills and leadership potential, but they also recognized the change that had occurred after Rebecca's disappearance. She'd become more cautious in her decision-making, more focused on following established procedures rather than innovating solutions to complex problems. Flight instructors noted that she'd lost some of the creative edge that had distinguished her early performance, though her technical proficiency remained exemplary. Captain Michael Torres, who had joined the squadron 6 months after Rebecca's disappearance, had tried several times to engage Sarah in conversations about her military experience and future goals. He was competent and well-meaning, someone who genuinely wanted to understand what had shaped his squadron mates into the officers they'd become. But Sarah found it difficult to explain how the absence of one person could fundamentally alter her relationship with military service itself. The truth was that Rebecca had represented everything Sarah loved about being a pilot. The intellectual challenge of mastering complex aircraft systems, the physical demands of high-performance flight, and the satisfaction of executing missions that contributed to national security objectives. Rebecca had made it all seem worthwhile, even when bureaucratic frustrations or equipment failures threatened to undermine their enthusiasm. Her loss had revealed how much of Sarah's motivation had been tied to their shared experience rather than her individual ambitions. 3 years of therapy sessions with base counselors had helped Sarah develop coping strategies for dealing with grief and uncertainty. She'd learned to compartmentalize her emotions during flight operations, to focus on immediate responsibilities rather than dwelling on unanswerable questions about Rebecca's fate. The sessions had been professionally helpful, but they hadn't addressed the fundamental issue that Sarah felt incomplete without her flying partner. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, the base psychologist who had conducted most of Sarah's counseling sessions, had explained that survivor's guilt was common among military personnel who lost close colleagues in training accidents or combat operations. The sense of responsibility for outcomes beyond individual control was a natural human response that required conscious effort to overcome. Sarah had nodded and agreed with the clinical assessments, but privately she knew that her feelings went deeper than textbook explanations could address. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The problem wasn't guilt about surviving when Rebecca hadn't. The problem was a persistent intuition that Rebecca's disappearance hadn't been accidental or final. Sarah couldn't articulate why she felt this way, couldn't point to specific evidence that contradicted official findings. But she'd spent enough time flying with Rebecca to trust her instincts about aviation-related matters, and those instincts suggested that something significant was being overlooked or deliberately concealed. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 years, Sarah found herself staring toward Hangar Delta 7 while she drank her coffee and prepared for another day of routine operations. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the outline of the building that housed Rebecca's F-22. Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, the crew chief responsible for maintaining the aircraft, had mentioned yesterday that the monthly inspection was scheduled for today. The jet would be pulled from the hangar, examined from nose to tail, and returned to storage in perfect condition. Sarah had never asked why the Air Force continued maintaining an aircraft with no assigned pilot. Military bureaucracy operated according to regulations that didn't always align with practical considerations, and questioning seemingly wasteful procedures wasn't encouraged among junior officers. But she suspected that someone with higher security clearance than hers understood reasons for keeping Rebecca's F-22 operational that went beyond standard administrative protocols. The base intercom crackled to life, announcing the morning briefing that would outline the day's training missions and operational assignments. Sarah finished her coffee and gathered the materials she'd need for her scheduled flight with Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a recent arrival from pilot training who showed considerable promise but needed experience with advanced tactical scenarios. It would be Sarah's responsibility to guide Walsh through her first high-altitude intercept exercise, a complex mission that required split-second timing and absolute trust between pilot and wingman. As Sarah walked toward the briefing room, she passed the memorial wall where Rebecca's name was engraved in black granite alongside 37 other Whitmore personnel who had died while serving their country. The inscription read simply, quote, Captain Rebecca Martinez, pilot, lost in service, October 2020. No mention of the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, no indication that her fate remained officially undetermined despite extensive investigation. Sarah paused beside the memorial, as she did every morning, and whispered the same words she'd spoken for 3 years. Still thinking about you, Becca. Still wondering what really happened out there. The ritual provided no answers, but it helped maintain a connection that death or disappearance hadn't been able to sever completely. The briefing room was filled with the familiar sounds of pilots preparing for another day of operations. Weather reports were being discussed, aircraft assignments were being confirmed, and mission objectives were being reviewed with the systematic thoroughness that characterized military aviation. Sarah took her usual seat near the back of the room, close enough to hear all instructions clearly but positioned where she could observe her colleagues without drawing attention to herself. Colonel Patterson entered the room with his characteristic brisk efficiency, carrying a folder of materials that would determine how 24 pilots spent their day. He was a competent commander who balanced operational requirements with personnel welfare considerations, someone who understood that effective leadership required both technical expertise and human insight. Sarah respected his judgment even when she disagreed with his conclusions about certain administrative matters. Good morning, everyone, Patterson began, his voice carrying the authority that came from 25 years of military service. We have a full schedule today, with emphasis on advanced tactical training for our newer personnel and continuation of the high-altitude reconnaissance protocols that have been under development since last quarter. Sarah felt her attention sharpen at the mention of reconnaissance protocols. Rebecca had been working on similar projects before her disappearance, though the details had never been shared with squadron personnel who lacked appropriate security clearances. The coincidence seemed worth noting, even if it led nowhere beyond idle speculation. Captain Chen, Patterson continued, you'll be leading Lieutenant Walsh through intercept scenarios at flight levels 400 through 500. Weather conditions are expected to remain stable throughout your mission window, but be prepared for possible wind shear at higher altitudes. Your aircraft assignments are posted on the duty board. Sarah nodded acknowledgement and made notes about the specific flight parameters that would govern her mission with Walsh. Intercept training was challenging under ideal conditions, requiring pilots to coordinate their movements with mathematical precision while operating aircraft capable of supersonic speeds. Adding wind shear to the equation would make the exercise significantly more complex, demanding absolute focus from both pilot and wingman. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering routine administrative matters and safety reminders that were repeated at every session regardless of their immediate relevance. Sarah had heard similar presentations hundreds of times, but she maintained attention out of professional habit and respect for the processes that kept military aviation as safe as humanly possible. Even routine briefings occasionally contained information that proved crucial during actual flight operations. After the formal briefing concluded, Sarah approached Lieutenant Walsh to discuss their mission parameters in detail. Walsh was 24 years old, a recent graduate of undergraduate pilot training who had demonstrated exceptional skill during her initial assignments at Whitmore. She possessed the combination of technical proficiency and situational awareness that characterized successful fighter pilots, but she still needed experience with the split-second decision-making that distinguished competent pilots from exceptional ones. "Ma'am," Walsh said, consulting her notes from the briefing, "I've reviewed the intercept protocols, but I wanted to confirm the communication procedures for high-altitude operations. The manual indicates some variations from standard radio protocols that I haven't encountered during previous training." Sarah smiled, recognizing the thoroughness that would serve Walsh well throughout her career. "Good question. High-altitude work requires modified communication protocols because of atmospheric interference and the extended ranges we'll be operating across. We'll use encrypted channels with automatic frequency switching to maintain contact, even if individual frequencies become compromised." They spent 15 minutes reviewing technical details that would be crucial during their mission. Walsh asked intelligent questions that demonstrated her commitment to understanding not just what procedures to follow, but why those procedures had been developed. Sarah found herself remembering similar conversations with Rebecca during their early days at Whitmore, when they'd both been eager to master every aspect of advanced fighter operations. The parallel was both comforting and painful. Rebecca had possessed the same intellectual curiosity that Walsh displayed, the same determination to excel that characterized pilots who advanced beyond basic competency. But Rebecca had also possessed an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that went beyond technical knowledge, an ability to sense when something wasn't quite right, even when instruments indicated normal operations. That intuition had kept them both alive during several missions that could have ended differently. Sarah wondered if Walsh would develop similar instincts with experience, or if that kind of situational awareness was something that couldn't be taught through conventional training methods. Rebecca had claimed that the best pilots learned to trust their subconscious processing of subtle environmental cues that conscious analysis might miss. She'd compared it to the way experienced drivers could sense potential accidents before they occurred, based on patterns of behavior that weren't immediately obvious but registered at some deeper level of awareness. After completing their pre-mission discussion, Sarah and Walsh walked toward the equipment room, where they would collect their flight gear and complete the personal preparations that preceded every sortie. The routine was familiar and comforting, a series of procedures that transformed civilian individuals into professional aviators capable of operating some of the most sophisticated aircraft ever constructed. Sarah pulled on her flight suit with practiced efficiency, checking pockets and connections that would be crucial during flight operations. The suit contained survival equipment, communication devices, and emergency procedures that could mean the difference between life and death if something went wrong at altitude. She'd never needed to use most of the equipment, but its presence provided psychological comfort that was almost as important as its practical functionality. Walsh was completing her own preparations with the methodical attention to detail that Sarah remembered from her own early assignments. Every zipper was checked, every connection was verified, and every piece of equipment was positioned exactly where muscle memory would expect to find it during emergency situations. The routine might seem excessive to outside observers, but it represented the accumulated wisdom of pilots who had learned that small oversights could have catastrophic consequences. As they walked toward the flight line where their aircraft waited, Sarah found herself thinking about the difference between routine training missions and the kind of operations that Rebecca had been involved with before her disappearance. Standard fighter training focused on known threats and established tactical scenarios, situations that had been studied and practiced until appropriate responses became automatic. But Rebecca's final project had apparently involved reconnaissance work that went beyond conventional parameters. The morning fog had lifted completely, revealing a clear sky that promised excellent flying conditions for their intercept training. Sarah could see their assigned F-22s parked on the ramp, surrounded by ground crews completing final pre-flight inspections. The aircraft looked identical from a distance, but she knew that subtle differences in avionics configurations and maintenance histories made each one unique in ways that experienced pilots learned to recognize. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached as they reached their aircraft, carrying clipboards that contained the detailed inspection reports required before every flight. Rodriguez had been maintaining fighter aircraft for 15 years, long enough to develop an encyclopedic knowledge of the systems that kept pilots alive at altitudes where human beings couldn't survive without technological assistance. "Good morning, Captain Chen," Rodriguez said, handing over the inspection reports. "Both aircraft are fully mission-capable. We replaced a navigation sensor in tail number 847 yesterday, but it's been tested and certified operational. Weather radar shows some possible turbulence developing over the northern training areas, but nothing outside your operational parameters." Sarah reviewed the maintenance logs with the careful attention that Rodriguez's professionalism deserved. Equipment failures were rare but potentially fatal, making pre-flight inspections crucial for identifying problems before they became emergencies. She'd learned from Rebecca's example to treat maintenance personnel as partners rather than subordinates, recognizing that their expertise was fundamental to flight safety. "Thanks, Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah replied. "Any word on when the northern training areas will be available for high-altitude work? I know they've been restricted for some kind of special operations lately." Rodriguez's expression became carefully neutral, the look that experienced non-commissioned officers adopted when discussing topics that approached classified boundaries. "Ma'am, I believe those restrictions are still in effect through the end of this month. You'll need to check with operations for current status updates." Sarah nodded, noting the diplomatic non-answer that suggested the restrictions involved activities beyond her need-to-know level. Military bases routinely hosted classified operations that were invisible to most personnel, but the timing seemed significant given the increased emphasis on reconnaissance protocols that Patterson had mentioned during the morning briefing. She wondered if the current restrictions were related to the project Rebecca had been working on before her disappearance. The northern training areas covered thousands of square miles of airspace that extended well into Arctic regions, exactly the kind of territory where high-altitude reconnaissance missions might be conducted. The coincidences were probably meaningless, but Sarah had learned to pay attention when patterns emerged from seemingly unrelated events. After completing their pre-flight inspections, Sarah and Walsh climbed into their respective cockpits and began the systematic process of bringing their aircraft to life. The F-22's startup sequence involved dozens of individual steps that transformed inert machinery into responsive extensions of pilot intention. Sarah had performed the routine thousands of times, but she never allowed familiarity to breed complacency about procedures that were literally matters of life and death. The cockpit felt like home, an environment where Sarah's training and experience merged into intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior. Every switch and indicator had a purpose. Every display provided information that could prove crucial during flight operations. She'd spent enough hours in similar cockpits to operate the controls without conscious thought, leaving her attention free to focus on tactical considerations and environmental awareness. "Raptor lead, this is Raptor 2, Walsh's voice came through the secure radio channel. "Pre-flight complete, ready for engine start." "Copy, Raptor 2, Sarah replied. "Engine start approved. Follow my lead for taxi and takeoff procedures." The twin Pratt & Whitney engines spooled up with a distinctive whine that characterized modern fighter aircraft, developing thrust that would soon lift them to altitudes where the curvature of the Earth became visible and the atmosphere grew thin enough to reveal the black of space beyond. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded every flight, the combination of technical challenge and physical sensation that had drawn her to military aviation in the first place. Ground control cleared them for taxi to the active runway, where they would await final clearance for takeoff. Sarah guided her aircraft along the taxiway with practiced precision, maintaining appropriate spacing from Walsh's fighter while monitoring radio communications from air traffic control. The base was busy this morning, with multiple aircraft movements requiring careful coordination to prevent conflicts on the ground or in the air. As they approached the runway threshold, Sarah noticed activity around Hangar Delta 7 that seemed unusual for a routine maintenance day. Several vehicles were parked near the building, including some that didn't belong to normal ground support operations. Personnel in civilian clothing were visible near the hangar entrance, talking with uniformed officers whose rank insignia Sarah couldn't identify from this distance. The observation lasted only a few seconds before air traffic control provided takeoff clearance, requiring Sarah's complete attention for the complex process of launching two fighter aircraft in formation. But the image of unusual activity around Rebecca's hangar remained in her mind as they accelerated down the runway and lifted into the morning sky, climbing toward altitudes where the training mission would test Walsh's skills and Sarah's instructional abilities. At 10,000 feet, with Whitmore Air Force Base shrinking to a collection of geometric shapes below them, Sarah felt the familiar sense of freedom that made all the bureaucratic frustrations of military life worthwhile. Up here, surrounded by infinite sky and unlimited possibilities, she could remember why she'd chosen to become a pilot in the first place. The aircraft responded to her slightest input, transforming thought into motion with technological precision that never ceased to amaze her. But even as she began the intercept training that would occupy the next 2 hours, part of her mind remained focused on the unusual activity she'd observed around Hangar Delta 7. Something was happening that went beyond routine maintenance, something that might be connected to the reconnaissance protocols that had been mentioned during the morning briefing. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah allowed herself to wonder if Rebecca's disappearance might be part of a larger story that was still being written. The training mission with Lieutenant Walsh had proceeded flawlessly, each intercept maneuver executed with textbook precision that demonstrated the younger pilot's growing confidence in high-altitude operations. They'd spent 2 hours practicing complex tactical scenarios at altitudes where the sky turned deep blue and the horizon curved visibly beneath them. Walsh had shown remarkable improvement in her reaction times and spatial awareness, qualities that would serve her well in actual combat situations should they ever arise. As they descended toward Whitmore Air Force Base for landing, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from successful instruction combined with competent performance. Training flights like this one represented the foundation of military aviation effectiveness, building skills that might someday prove crucial in defending national interests. The routine nature of the mission had been comforting after the morning's speculation about unusual activities around Hangar Delta 7. But as their aircraft touched down on the runway and began the taxi back to their assigned parking spaces, Sarah noticed that the unusual activity she'd observed earlier had intensified rather than diminished. More vehicles were now parked around the hangar, including several that bore no identifying markings and appeared to be government-issued but not standard Air Force equipment. Personnel in civilian clothing were more numerous, and their movements suggested some kind of coordinated operation rather than routine maintenance inspection. After completing post-flight procedures and securing their aircraft, Sarah and Walsh walked toward the debriefing room, where they would review the training mission's successes and areas for improvement. The debriefing process was standard protocol, designed to maximize learning from every flight while identifying any issues that might affect future operations. Sarah had participated in hundreds of similar sessions, but she found her attention divided between Walsh's performance assessment and curiosity about the ongoing activity near Rebecca's hangar. "Ma'am," Walsh said as they entered the debriefing room, "I wanted to thank you for the patience you showed during the high-altitude intercepts. I know my timing was off on the third scenario, but your guidance helped me understand where I was making calculation errors." Sarah smiled, recognizing the dedication that made Walsh a promising addition to their squadron. "Your improvement throughout the mission was impressive, Lieutenant. The calculation errors you mentioned are common when pilots are adapting to the unique challenges of high-altitude flight. With more practice, those adjustments will become automatic." They spent 30 minutes reviewing each phase of the training mission in detail, analyzing data from their aircraft's recording systems, and discussing alternative approaches to the tactical scenarios they'd encountered. Walsh asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated her commitment to continuous improvement, while Sarah provided guidance based on years of experience with similar situations. The session was productive and professionally satisfying, exactly the kind of interaction that made instructional duties rewarding. But throughout the debriefing, Sarah found herself glancing toward the window that offered a partial view of Hangar Delta 7. The level of activity remained elevated, and she could see personnel entering and leaving the building with equipment that looked more sophisticated than standard maintenance tools. Whatever was happening there appeared to involve detailed examination of Rebecca's F-22, though the purpose remained unclear from her distant vantage point. After Walsh departed to complete her own post-flight paperwork, Sarah remained in the debriefing room for several minutes, ostensibly reviewing mission reports but actually trying to make sense of the unusual activity she'd been observing. Her security clearance provided access to most operational information at Whitmore, but certain classified projects remained beyond her need-to-know level. The civilian personnel and unmarked vehicles suggested involvement by agencies or organizations that operated outside normal Air Force channels. The possibility that Rebecca's disappearance might be connected to ongoing classified operations had occurred to Sarah before, but she'd dismissed such speculation as wishful thinking born of grief and denial. The official investigation had been thorough, involving multiple agencies and extensive resources. If there had been evidence of foul play or classified circumstances, surely it would have been discovered and acted upon appropriately. Yet the timing of increased activity around Rebecca's aircraft, combined with the morning's emphasis on reconnaissance protocols, suggested connections that went beyond coincidence. Sarah had learned during her military career to trust patterns that emerged from seemingly unrelated events, even when logical analysis couldn't explain their significance. Her instincts were telling her that something important was happening, something that might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted her for 3 years. As she walked toward her office to complete the day's administrative tasks, Sarah passed Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who was heading in the direction of Hangar Delta 7 carrying a toolbox and looking more serious than usual. Rodriguez was normally available for casual conversation about aircraft maintenance or base operations, but today she seemed focused on urgent responsibilities that didn't allow time for social interaction. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah called out, hoping to learn something about the unusual activity without appearing overly curious. "Everything okay with the maintenance schedule today? I noticed quite a bit of activity around Delta 7. Rodriguez paused, her expression becoming carefully neutral in the way that experienced military personnel adopted when discussing sensitive topics. "Ma'am, we're conducting some special inspections today. Nothing that affects normal flight operations, but it's keeping everyone pretty busy." The response was professionally appropriate but uninformative, exactly what Sarah had expected from someone who understood the boundaries of classified information. Rodriguez's demeanor suggested that the, quote, special inspections involved more than routine maintenance procedures, but she clearly wasn't authorized to discuss details with personnel who lacked appropriate security clearances. "I understand," Sarah replied. "Let me know if you need any assistance with scheduling or resource allocation. I know how complex these special projects can become." Rodriguez nodded and continued toward the hangar, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers, but a clearer sense that significant events were unfolding behind the scenes. The brief conversation had confirmed that the activity around Rebecca's aircraft was indeed unusual and probably classified, but it hadn't provided any insight into the specific nature or purpose of the operation. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon completing routine paperwork and reviewing flight schedules for the coming week. Her duties as a senior captain included administrative responsibilities that were essential but less satisfying than actual flying. She processed training reports, updated personnel records, and coordinated with other squadron leaders about resource allocation and mission planning. The work was important for maintaining operational readiness, but it lacked the immediate engagement and clear objectives that made flight operations so appealing. Throughout the afternoon, she found herself glancing frequently toward Hangar Delta 7, noting the continued presence of unusual vehicles and personnel. The activity level remained high, suggesting that whatever examination or operation was underway required extensive time and specialized expertise. Sarah's curiosity grew stronger as the hours passed, but she recognized that direct inquiry would be inappropriate and potentially counterproductive. As evening approached and normal base operations began winding down, Sarah noticed that the activity around the hangar was also decreasing. Most of the civilian personnel and unmarked vehicles had departed, leaving only standard Air Force security and a few individuals whose purposes weren't immediately apparent. The change suggested that whatever had been accomplished during the day was either complete or being continued in a more discreet manner. Colonel Patterson appeared in her office doorway as she was preparing to leave for the day, carrying a folder that looked official and slightly worn from handling. His expression was serious but not alarmed, the look of a commander dealing with complex situations that required careful consideration rather than immediate action. "Captain Chen," he said, stepping into her office and closing the door behind him. "I need to discuss something with you that requires absolute discretion." What I'm about to tell you cannot be shared with anyone else on this base without explicit authorization from me personally." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, recognizing the tone that preceded classified briefings or sensitive assignments. "Understood, sir. You have my complete discretion." Patterson took a seat across from her desk and opened the folder, revealing documents that were heavily redacted and marked with security classifications she'd rarely encountered. 3 years ago, when Captain Martinez disappeared during that training mission over the Arctic, there were aspects of the incident that couldn't be included in the official investigation report. Circumstances that required classification at levels above most personnel's clearance. The mention of Rebecca's disappearance sent a chill through Sarah's chest, but she maintained professional composure while waiting for Patterson to continue. The possibility that there had been classified elements to Rebecca's final mission was something she'd speculated about privately, but hearing official confirmation felt both validating and terrifying. Captain Martinez wasn't conducting routine training when her aircraft disappeared, Patterson continued. She was involved in a highly classified reconnaissance operation that involved territories and objectives that remain sensitive even today. Her disappearance occurred during the execution of that mission, under circumstances that we've never been able to fully explain or resolve. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of what she was hearing. Rebecca had been conducting classified operations that went beyond anything they'd discussed or trained for together. Her final mission had involved risks and objectives that had been concealed from everyone else in their squadron, including her closest friend and regular flying partner. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "are you telling me that Rebecca was operating under orders that I wasn't cleared to know about? That her disappearance was connected to classified activities rather than a training accident?" Patterson nodded, his expression reflecting the weight of information he'd been carrying for 3 years. Captain Martinez volunteered for an assignment that required absolute secrecy, even from her squadron mates. The mission involved reconnaissance of areas that are disputed territory, where official presence would create diplomatic complications. Her aircraft was equipped with specialized sensors and communication equipment that aren't standard for training missions. The revelation explained so much about Rebecca's behavior in the weeks before her disappearance. The late nights in her office, the classified materials she'd been reluctant to discuss, the project that had seemed to consume her attention despite her attempts to maintain normal social interactions. She'd been preparing for an operation that required skills and knowledge beyond their shared training experience. "What happened to her out there?" Sarah asked, though she suspected that Patterson's answer would be limited by ongoing classification requirements. "We don't know," Patterson admitted. "Her aircraft disappeared from radar while she was conducting reconnaissance over territory that's technically international waters but practically controlled by hostile forces. Search and rescue operations were limited by diplomatic considerations and the classified nature of her mission. We've never found any trace of her aircraft or evidence of what caused her disappearance." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and frustration wash over her. Relief that Rebecca's disappearance hadn't been the result of pilot error or preventable accident, and frustration that the truth had been concealed for 3 years while she'd struggled with guilt and unanswered questions. The official narrative of training accident had been a cover story designed to protect classified operations rather than an accurate assessment of what had actually occurred. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "What's changed that makes this information something I need to know?" Patterson leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "Because we've received intelligence suggesting that Captain Martinez might still be alive. Evidence that her disappearance wasn't fatal, but resulted in capture by forces that have been holding her in a location we've only recently been able to identify. The activity you've observed around her aircraft today was preparation for a rescue operation that we're planning to launch within the next 48 hours. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, overwhelming her with emotions she'd thought were finally under control. Rebecca might be alive. After 3 years of grief and acceptance, after memorial services and official declarations of death, there was a possibility that her closest friend had survived whatever had happened over the Arctic Ocean. The implications were staggering and almost too significant to process rationally. "A rescue operation," Sarah repeated, struggling to maintain professional composure while her mind reeled with possibilities. "What kind of rescue operation? Where is she being held?" "The intelligence indicates that Captain Martinez is being held at a facility in the disputed Arctic territories," Probably by the same forces that were responsible for her capture 3 years ago, Patterson explained. The facility is heavily defended and located in an area where conventional rescue operations would be extremely difficult. We need someone with exceptional flying skills and intimate knowledge of Captain Martinez's capabilities to have any chance of success. Sarah felt understanding dawn as she realized why Patterson was sharing this classified information with her. "You want me to fly the rescue mission? You are Captain Martinez's closest friend and most frequent flying partner," Patterson confirmed. "You know her better than anyone else in this squadron. Understand how she thinks and reacts under pressure. If anyone can locate her and extract her successfully, it would be someone who's flown with her extensively and can anticipate her responses to complex situations." The opportunity to finally do something concrete about Rebecca's disappearance was overwhelming, but Sarah recognized the enormous risks and challenges involved. A rescue mission in disputed Arctic territory would require flying through hostile airspace, locating a heavily defended facility, and extracting a prisoner who might be injured or unable to assist in her own rescue. The technical demands would be extraordinary, and the political consequences of failure could be severe. "What makes you think she's still alive after 3 years?" Sarah asked. "What kind of intelligence are we talking about?" Patterson consulted the classified documents in his folder, clearly weighing how much information he could share even with someone being considered for the rescue mission. Satellite imagery has identified what appears to be an American pilot at the facility in question. The individual's physical characteristics and behavior patterns are consistent with Captain Martinez, though we can't make positive identification from the available imagery. Additionally, intercepted communications have referenced a captured American pilot who's been providing limited cooperation with interrogation efforts. The description sent chills through Sarah's chest as she imagined Rebecca enduring 3 years of captivity in an Arctic facility controlled by hostile forces. The physical and psychological challenges of such an experience would be enormous, potentially changing her friend in ways that might affect any rescue attempt. But the possibility that Rebecca was alive and could be brought home outweighed any concerns about the mission's complexity or dangers. "When would this rescue operation take place?" Sarah asked. "How much time do I have to prepare?" "The mission window opens in 36 hours, Patterson replied. "Weather conditions and facility security patterns create a brief opportunity that won't occur again for several months. If Captain Martinez is going to be rescued, it has to happen during this upcoming window." The timeline was incredibly compressed, requiring preparation and planning that would normally take weeks or months. Sarah would need to familiarize herself with specialized equipment, study intelligence reports about the target facility, and develop tactical approaches for scenarios that were unlike anything in her previous experience. The pressure was enormous, but the opportunity to bring Rebecca home made any sacrifice worthwhile. "I'll do it," Sarah said without hesitation. "Whatever preparation is needed, whatever risks are involved, I'll fly the rescue mission." Patterson smiled for the first time during their conversation, expressing relief that Sarah had accepted the assignment, despite its obvious dangers. "I hoped you'd say that. We've already begun modifying Captain Martinez's F-22 for the specific requirements of this mission. The aircraft will be equipped with extended-range fuel systems, specialized navigation equipment, and stealth modifications that will allow penetration of heavily defended airspace." The irony of using Rebecca's own aircraft for her rescue wasn't lost on Sarah. The F-22 that had been maintained in perfect condition for 3 years would finally fly again, carrying the person who knew Rebecca best on a mission to bring her home. The symbolism felt appropriate and somehow predestined, as if the aircraft had been waiting for exactly this purpose. "What about official authorization?" Sarah asked. "This kind of rescue mission would normally require approval at the highest levels of government." "Authorization has been obtained through channels that I can't discuss in detail," Patterson replied. "The mission is officially classified as a training exercise with experimental equipment, but you'll have complete operational authority once you're airborne. Success or failure will depend entirely on your skills and judgment." The briefing continued for another hour, covering technical details that would be crucial for mission success. Sarah learned about the modified aircraft systems, the intelligence estimates of facility defenses, and the communication protocols that would coordinate her operation with support elements she wouldn't be able to see or contact directly. The complexity was staggering, But her confidence grew as she understood the resources and planning that had been devoted to bringing Rebecca home. As the briefing concluded and Patterson prepared to leave, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that was unlike anything she'd experienced during her military career. Tomorrow would bring intensive preparation for a mission that could either reunite her with her closest friend or result in her own death in the Arctic wilderness. The stakes couldn't be higher, but the opportunity was exactly what she'd been hoping for during 3 years of unanswered questions. "Captain Chen," Patterson said as he reached her office door, "I want you to understand that this mission is entirely voluntary. If you have any doubts about your ability to complete it successfully, now is the time to express them. Once preparation begins tomorrow morning, we'll be committed to the operation." Sarah looked toward the window where Hangar Delta 7 was visible in the distance, containing the aircraft that would carry her toward whatever remained of Rebecca Martinez after 3 years of captivity. "I don't have any doubts, sir. Rebecca would do the same for me if our situations were reversed. Bringing her home is worth any risk." That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the classified materials that Patterson had authorized her to study. Intelligence reports described a facility built into Arctic mountainside, powered by geothermal sources, and defended by surface-to-air missile systems that could engage aircraft at extreme ranges. The location was remote enough that conventional ground assault would be impossible, making aerial extraction the only viable rescue option. Satellite imagery showed a compound that appeared to house between 50 and 100 personnel, with security procedures that followed predictable patterns but included overlapping coverage that would make undetected approach extremely difficult. The facility's purpose wasn't entirely clear from the available intelligence, but it appeared to be some kind of research installation rather than a standard military base or prison camp. The most disturbing aspect of the intelligence reports was the description of prisoners being held at the facility. Besides the American pilot believed to be Rebecca, there were apparently several other individuals whose nationalities and circumstances weren't specified in the materials Sarah was cleared to review. The facility seemed to be used for holding people who had acquired sensitive information or skills that were valuable to whoever controlled the installation. Sarah studied floor plans and security assessments until well past midnight, memorizing details that could prove crucial during the rescue attempt. The facility's layout suggested that prisoners were held in a section that was partially underground, providing protection from Arctic weather but making extraction more complex. She would need to locate Rebecca among potentially dozens of other prisoners, confirm her identity and condition, and extract her through heavily defended airspace. The technical challenges were matched by psychological considerations that were equally daunting. Rebecca had been held captive for 3 years under conditions that were certainly harsh and possibly brutal. She might be injured, psychologically traumatized, or changed in ways that would affect her ability to assist in her own rescue. Sarah needed to be prepared for finding someone who looked like Rebecca, but might not be the same person she remembered from their shared experiences at Whitmore. As she finally tried to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversations she and Rebecca had shared about hypothetical scenarios involving capture and rescue. They'd discussed survival techniques, resistance to interrogation, and methods for maintaining psychological resilience during extended captivity. Rebecca had always maintained that the key to surviving imprisonment was preserving hope that rescue would eventually come, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. The irony was that Sarah had spent 3 years believing Rebecca was dead, while Rebecca might have been spending the same period believing that rescue was possible. If the intelligence was accurate, Rebecca had somehow maintained enough hope and resilience to survive conditions that would have broken most people. The strength required for such endurance was almost unimaginable, but it was consistent with the determination that had made Rebecca such an exceptional pilot. Tomorrow would bring final preparations for a mission that would either validate that hope or confirm that some losses were indeed permanent. Sarah fell asleep thinking about Rebecca's voice during their last conversation, discussing dinner plans and routine concerns that had seemed important at the time but now appeared trivial compared to the ordeal she might have been enduring ever since. The next morning arrived with weather conditions that were perfect for flying, but would make the rescue mission even more challenging. Clear Arctic skies would provide excellent visibility for locating the target facility, but they would also make Sarah's approach more visible to defensive systems. The mission would require threading a careful balance between the visibility needed for navigation and the concealment necessary for survival. Sarah arrived at Hangar Delta 7 before dawn to begin her familiarization with the modified F-22 that would carry her toward Rebecca's location. The aircraft looked identical to a standard Raptor from the outside, but internal modifications were extensive and sophisticated. Additional fuel capacity had been integrated into the fuselage, specialized navigation systems had been installed in the cockpit, and stealth characteristics had been enhanced through techniques that weren't described in any manual she'd previously seen. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting beside the aircraft with technical manuals and a checklist that was 3 times longer than standard pre-flight procedures. Her expression was serious but supportive, reflecting understanding of the mission's importance despite her limited knowledge of specific operational details. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, handing over the modified procedures, "we've spent all night getting her ready for whatever it is you're planning to do. The aircraft is in perfect condition, but some of these systems are experimental and might behave differently than you're used to. We've included emergency procedures for situations that hopefully won't arise, but it's better to be prepared." Sarah spent 2 hours familiarizing herself with controls and displays that were similar to standard F-22 systems, but incorporated capabilities that extended far beyond normal operational parameters. The navigation system could apparently operate in environments where GPS signals were unavailable or compromised, using alternative reference sources that weren't described in detail. Communication equipment included frequencies and encryption methods that were unlike anything in her previous experience. Most significantly, the aircraft's stealth characteristics had been enhanced through modifications that made it virtually invisible to detection methods that might be used by the facility's defensive systems. The improvements came at a cost in terms of maneuverability and maximum speed, but they would provide crucial advantages when penetrating heavily defended airspace. The modified ejection seat included survival equipment that was specifically configured for Arctic conditions, with supplies and tools that could sustain 2 people for several days if ground survival became necessary. The implication was clear. If the rescue attempt failed and she was forced to land in hostile territory, she would need to be prepared for extended survival with Rebecca until alternative extraction could be arranged. As morning progressed into afternoon, Sarah completed her preparation and received final intelligence updates that refined her understanding of the target facility and its defensive capabilities. The mission would launch at sunset, taking advantage of changing light conditions that would provide concealment during the most vulnerable phases of flight. Weather forecasts remained favorable, with clear skies and minimal wind that would optimize both navigation accuracy and stealth performance. Colonel Patterson appeared for a final briefing that covered communication protocols and emergency procedures that would apply if the mission encountered problems that prevented normal extraction. Sarah would be operating beyond the range of most support assets, requiring self-reliance and improvisation if circumstances deviated from planned scenarios. "Captain Chen," Patterson said as the briefing concluded, "you should understand that this mission is unprecedented in several ways. We've never attempted a rescue operation in such heavily defended territory, using experimental equipment that hasn't been fully tested under operational conditions. Success will depend entirely on your skills and judgment, with minimal support available if things go wrong." Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence you're showing by assigning me to this mission. I won't let you down. Or Captain Martinez either." As evening approached and final preparations neared completion, Sarah found herself standing beside Rebecca's modified F-22, thinking about the friendship that had brought her to this moment. 3 years of grief and unanswered questions were about to be resolved one way or another. Either she would succeed in bringing Rebecca home, or she would join her in whatever fate had befallen American pilots who ventured into territories that existed beyond official maps and acknowledged conflicts. The sun was setting over Whitmore Air Force Base, painting the sky in colors that reminded Sarah of the Arctic auroras that Rebecca had always wanted to see. Tonight, if the intelligence was accurate and the mission succeeded, they might finally have the opportunity to witness those natural phenomena together. The possibility of sharing such an experience with her closest friend provided motivation that outweighed any concerns about the dangers ahead. The modified F-22 lifted off from Whitmore's runway at precisely 2,147 hours, climbing into Arctic darkness that would provide cover for the next 8 hours of flight toward coordinates that existed in no official navigation database. Sarah felt the aircraft respond to her inputs with subtle differences that reflected the extensive modifications Rodriguez and her team had performed. The additional fuel weight changed the handling characteristics slightly, while the enhanced stealth systems created electromagnetic signatures that felt alien compared to her previous experience with standard Raptors. Navigation toward the target required following a flight path that avoided commercial air traffic corridors and military radar installations that might detect even a heavily modified stealth aircraft. Sarah's route took her north over Canadian wilderness, then west across the Beaufort Sea toward the disputed Arctic territories where intelligence indicated Rebecca was being held. The journey would cover nearly 3,000 miles through some of the most remote airspace on Earth. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah crossed into regions where GPS signals became unreliable due to magnetic interference and atmospheric conditions unique to extreme northern latitudes. The modified navigation system compensated automatically using alternative reference sources that included stellar positioning and inertial guidance systems that operated independently of external signals. The technology was impressive, but it required constant monitoring to ensure accuracy in an environment where small errors could prove fatal. The Arctic Ocean stretched endlessly below, a frozen wasteland broken only by pressure ridges and occasional leads of dark water that appeared black against the white ice. Sarah had flown over similar terrain during training exercises, but never at night and never on a mission where navigation errors could result in her own capture or death. The isolation was absolute, creating a sense of vulnerability that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. As she approached the coordinates where Rebecca's aircraft had disappeared 3 years ago, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation they'd had before that final mission. Rebecca had seemed unusually serious, talking about responsibilities that extended beyond normal squadron duties, and the importance of completing assignments that others couldn't understand. At the time, Sarah had assumed her friend was referring to the career pressures that affected all ambitious officers. Now she understood that Rebecca had been preparing herself psychologically for an operation that might require the ultimate sacrifice. The facility appeared on Sarah's instruments before becoming visible to the naked eye, a cluster of heat signatures and electromagnetic emissions that stood out against the cold Arctic landscape. Intelligence estimates had been accurate regarding the installation's size and defensive capabilities. Surface-to-air missile sites were positioned to provide overlapping coverage of approaches from all directions, while radar installations swept the surrounding airspace with patterns that would detect most conventional aircraft long before they posed any threat. Sarah began her approach using techniques that pushed the modified F-22's stealth capabilities to their absolute limits. She descended to an altitude that kept her below the horizon relative to the facility's radar installations, while maintaining enough height to avoid terrain obstacles that weren't accurately mapped. The balance required constant adjustment as she navigated through mountains that rose unexpectedly from the frozen landscape. The facility itself was larger than satellite imagery had suggested, built into a natural depression between rocky peaks that provided protection from Arctic winds and partial concealment from aerial observation. Multiple buildings were connected by covered walkways that allowed personnel movement without exposure to the harsh climate. Security perimeters included both electronic sensors and human guards who maintained regular patrols despite the extreme conditions. Finding a landing site that would allow her to approach the facility on foot required circling the area at low altitude while avoiding detection by the installation's defensive systems. Sarah identified a narrow valley approximately 2 miles from the target that offered concealment for her aircraft while providing a route that might allow undetected infiltration. The approach would require hiking across difficult terrain and sub-zero temperatures, but it was the only option that offered reasonable chances of success. The landing was more challenging than any she'd attempted in her career, requiring precise control in gusty winds that threatened to slam her aircraft into the rocky walls of the narrow valley. The modified F-22 touched down on improvised runway that was barely long enough to accommodate its landing roll, coming to rest between boulders that provided natural camouflage for the aircraft's distinctive silhouette. Sarah completed shutdown procedures as quickly as possible, knowing that every minute on the ground increased the risk of discovery by patrol aircraft or ground reconnaissance teams that might be operating in the area. The Arctic survival gear included in her ejection seat was designed for the extreme conditions she would encounter during the infiltration, but it would provide only limited protection against temperatures that could prove fatal within hours of exposure. The hike toward the facility took nearly 3 hours across terrain that alternated between loose scree and solid ice that threatened to send her tumbling into crevasses hidden by snow cover. Navigation required careful attention to compass bearings and landmark recognition, while maintaining noise discipline that would prevent detection by acoustic sensors or human sentries. The physical demands were exhausting, but Sarah's training and determination kept her moving toward the objective. As she approached the facility's outer perimeter, Sarah could see that security was more sophisticated than intelligence reports had indicated. Motion sensors were positioned to detect approach from multiple directions, while thermal imaging systems scanned for heat signatures that would reveal human presence. Guard towers provided elevated observation points that commanded views of all likely infiltration routes, making undetected approach extremely difficult. The prisoner section was located in the underground portion of the facility, accessible through entrances that were monitored by both human guards and electronic surveillance systems. Sarah studied the security patterns for nearly an hour, identifying a brief window when shift changes and routine maintenance activities might provide an opportunity for infiltration. The timing would need to be perfect, requiring her to move through multiple checkpoints without triggering alarms that would compromise the entire rescue attempt. Entry into the facility required techniques that Sarah had learned during survival training, but never expected to use in actual operations. She crawled through a maintenance tunnel that carried heating pipes between buildings, enduring temperatures that were hot enough to cause burns while remaining quiet enough to avoid detection by acoustic sensors. The tunnel eventually led to a mechanical room that provided access to the main facility through a service corridor that appeared to be unmonitored. The underground prisoner section was a maze of corridors and cells that housed far more people than intelligence estimates had suggested. Sarah counted at least 30 individual holding areas, most of which appeared to be occupied by prisoners whose identities and circumstances she couldn't determine. The facility was apparently used for long-term detention of individuals whose capture or presence couldn't be acknowledged through official channels. Finding Rebecca required systematic search through the prisoner section while avoiding detection by guards who maintained irregular patrols through the area. Sarah moved carefully from cell to cell, using hand signals and whispered words to communicate with prisoners who might be able to provide information about Rebecca's location. Most of the detainees appeared to be in poor physical condition, suggesting that medical care was minimal and living conditions were harsh. In the facility's deepest section, Sarah finally found a cell that contained a figure who looked like Rebecca but had been changed by 3 years of captivity. The woman was thinner than Sarah remembered, with scars that spoke of interrogation and abuse that had tested her physical and psychological limits, but her eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had made Rebecca such an exceptional pilot, confirming that essential elements of her personality had survived the ordeal. Recognition was mutual and immediate despite the changes that captivity had wrought. Rebecca's whispered greeting carried a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief that validated the hope she'd maintained throughout 3 years of imprisonment. "Sarah, how did you find me? How did you get here?" "Long story," Sarah replied, working on the electronic lock that secured Rebecca's cell. "The important thing is getting you out of here." "Can you walk? Are you injured?" Rebecca struggled to her feet, testing limbs that had been weakened by malnutrition and limited exercise. "I can make it. But there are others here, Sarah. American personnel who've been held even longer than I have. We can't leave them behind." The ethical dilemma was one that Sarah had hoped to avoid but had prepared for during mission planning. Rescuing additional prisoners would complicate extraction enormously, potentially compromising the entire operation and reducing the chances of anyone reaching safety. But abandoning American personnel who had been forgotten by their government was morally unacceptable, regardless of the operational challenges involved. "How many others?" Sarah asked. "Where are they being held?" Rebecca pointed toward the facility's northern section. "4, that I know of for certain. Air Force, Navy, and CIA personnel who were captured during operations that were never officially acknowledged. They're in worse condition than I am, but they're still alive." The rescue became exponentially more complex with the addition of 4 prisoners who would need assistance during the extraction. Sarah's modified F-22 had been configured for 2 people at maximum, making aircraft extraction impossible for the enlarged group. Alternative plans would need to be improvised using resources available at the facility or through overland escape routes that extended across hundreds of miles of Arctic wilderness. Rebecca led Sarah through corridors that she'd memorized during 3 years of captivity, avoiding security cameras and guard posts that could compromise their movement. The other American prisoners were indeed in poor condition, suffering from injuries that had never received proper medical treatment, and psychological trauma that reflected extended periods of interrogation and abuse. But they retained enough physical capability to attempt escape if they received assistance with the most challenging aspects of extraction. The group's movement through the facility required careful coordination to avoid detection, while maintaining the pace necessary to reach Sarah's aircraft before dawn exposed them to aerial reconnaissance. Each prisoner needed different levels of assistance, from Rebecca, who could move independently despite her weakened condition, to a Navy pilot who required support for walking due to injuries that had never healed properly. As they approached the facility's outer perimeter, alarms began sounding throughout the installation, indicating that their escape had been discovered by guards conducting routine prisoner checks. Searchlights swept the surrounding area while security teams deployed to intercept escape attempts, using predetermined protocols that suggested such incidents had occurred before. The timing was unfortunate but not unexpected, given the complexity of extracting multiple prisoners from a heavily secured installation. The group's movement toward Sarah's aircraft became a running battle across terrain that offered minimal concealment from pursuit teams equipped with night vision equipment and thermal imaging systems. Rebecca and the other prisoners pushed themselves beyond their physical limits, driven by the knowledge that recapture would result in treatment far worse than what they'd already endured. Sarah provided covering fire when necessary while guiding the group along the route she'd used during infiltration. Reaching the narrow valley where the F-22 was concealed required crossing exposed terrain that left them vulnerable to pursuit teams that were rapidly closing the distance. The aircraft was exactly where Sarah had left it, camouflaged among the boulders but ready for immediate departure once she could complete startup procedures. The challenge was accommodating 5 people in an aircraft designed for single-pilot operations, using modifications that had been intended for 2 people at maximum. Rebecca took charge of organizing the other prisoners, while Sarah began the startup sequence that would prepare their escape vehicle for immediate departure. The modified ejection seat could accommodate 2 people if they shared the safety harness system, while the cargo compartment behind the cockpit could hold additional passengers if they could endure the physical stress of high-performance flight without proper restraint systems. The arrangement was dangerous under ideal conditions and potentially fatal during the kind of aggressive maneuvering that would be required to escape the facility's defensive systems. But the alternatives were capture and almost certain execution for everyone involved in the rescue attempt. Sarah explained the risks to the prisoners while completing pre-flight procedures that were more critical than any she'd performed in her career. Takeoff from the improvised runway required maximum performance from both aircraft and pilot, with pursuit teams closing to weapons range just as the F-22 began its takeoff roll. Small arms fire sparked off the rocky valley walls while the aircraft accelerated toward the minimum speed needed for flight. Sarah lifted off with barely enough airspeed to maintain controlled flight, climbing slowly while evasive maneuvers tested the modified aircraft's capabilities and the endurance of passengers who lacked proper safety equipment. The facility's surface-to-air missile systems engaged as soon as the F-22 cleared the valley walls, launching weapons that were designed to destroy aircraft with far less sophisticated defensive capabilities. Sarah's evasive flying pushed the aircraft and its passengers to physical limits that bordered on unconsciousness, but the enhanced stealth characteristics prevented weapon systems from maintaining the targeting locks necessary for successful engagement. Breaking free from the facility's defensive coverage area required nearly 30 minutes of intensive flying that exhausted both pilot and passengers. When the immediate threat finally diminished, Sarah found herself responsible for navigating an overloaded aircraft across 3,000 miles of Arctic wilderness towards safety that remained uncertain despite their successful escape from captivity. The fuel warning light illuminated as they crossed into Canadian airspace, indicating that the extended flight time and aggressive maneuvering during escape had consumed more aviation fuel than Sarah's calculations had projected. The modified F-22 was carrying nearly twice its designed passenger load while operating at weights that stressed every system beyond normal parameters. Mathematical certainty indicated they wouldn't reach Whitmore Air Force Base with current fuel reserves. Rebecca, strapped into the cramped confines of the modified ejection seat behind Sarah, monitored the aircraft's systems with professional expertise that hadn't diminished despite 3 years of captivity. Her voice carried the calm authority that Sarah remembered from their shared missions, though physical weakness was evident in every word she spoke. "Fuel consumption is running 15% higher than projected," Rebecca observed, studying the digital displays that showed their aircraft's condition. "We need alternative landing options within the next 90 minutes, or we're going to be conducting an emergency landing in wilderness that won't support rescue operations. The other rescued prisoners, crowded into spaces never intended for human occupancy, endured the flight with quiet determination that reflected their understanding of the stakes involved. Commander James Sullivan, the Navy pilot whose injuries made movement difficult, maintained situational awareness despite obvious pain from wounds that had never properly healed. Captain Lisa Rodriguez from the CIA remained alert to potential threats despite exhaustion that bordered on collapse. Lieutenant Michael Zhang, the youngest of the rescued personnel, assisted the others while monitoring their physical condition with medical training that was proving invaluable. Sarah calculated distance and fuel consumption rates while reviewing emergency airfield options that might accommodate their overloaded aircraft. Military installations throughout northern Canada could provide landing facilities, but approaching them would require explanations that might compromise the classified nature of their rescue operation. Civilian airports lack the security protocols necessary for handling the kind of sensitive personnel and equipment involved in their mission. The solution emerged from Sarah's memory of training exercises conducted with Canadian forces during her early career at Whitmore. Cold Lake Air Base in Alberta had hosted joint operations that involved both American and Canadian personnel, creating relationships that might provide unofficial assistance during emergency situations. The facility was equipped to handle fighter aircraft and staffed with personnel who understood the requirements of classified operations. "I'm diverting to Cold Lake," Sarah announced through the aircraft's internal communication system. "We have contacts there who might be able to help without creating diplomatic complications. Everyone needs to prepare for landing procedures that are going to be challenging with our current passenger configuration." The approach to Cold Lake required careful coordination with Canadian Air Traffic Control, using radio procedures that indicated emergency status without revealing specific details about their passenger load or mission parameters. Sarah identified herself using authentication codes that confirmed her status as an American military pilot while requesting immediate landing clearance due to fuel emergency. Major Patricia Morrison, the Canadian officer who responded to Sarah's emergency request, recognized the call signs and aircraft type from previous joint operations. Her voice carried professional concern, combined with understanding that some military situations required immediate assistance without extensive questioning. "American Raptor, you are cleared for emergency landing on runway 09. Emergency vehicles are being positioned, and we're clearing all other traffic from your approach path. Be aware that weather conditions include crosswinds gusting to 25 knots." The landing was more challenging than any Sarah had attempted during her career, requiring precise control of an aircraft whose weight distribution and handling characteristics had been fundamentally altered by the presence of additional passengers. Crosswinds threatened to push them off the runway centerline, while the modified F-22 struggled to maintain directional control during the critical seconds between touchdown and full stop. Rebecca provided guidance based on her own extensive experience with overweight landing procedures, calling out airspeed and attitude corrections that helped Sarah maintain control during the most dangerous phase of flight. The other passengers braced themselves as best they could, while the aircraft decelerated through a landing roll that seemed to continue forever, before finally coming to rest on the Canadian runway. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft immediately after shutdown, providing medical assistance to passengers whose physical condition reflected the harsh treatment they'd endured during captivity. Canadian medical personnel worked with quiet efficiency, asking no questions about how American prisoners had arrived at their base, while focusing entirely on immediate healthcare needs that couldn't be delayed. Major Morrison approached Sarah as she completed post-flight procedures that documented the emergency landing and aircraft condition. The Canadian officer's expression reflected curiosity balanced by professional discretion that recognized when full explanations weren't immediately possible. "Captain Chen," Morrison said, consulting identification that Sarah provided along with her emergency landing documentation. "We've prepared quarters for your passengers and arranged medical support for anyone who needs treatment. I assume you'll be coordinating with your command structure about whatever brought you here." Sarah nodded gratefully, understanding that Morrison's assistance was being provided without requirement for detailed explanations that might compromise operational security. "Major, I appreciate the help more than I can express. My passengers have been through an ordeal that's going to require extended medical evaluation before they're ready for transport back to the United States." The rescued prisoners were transferred to Cold Lake's medical facility, where Canadian doctors began comprehensive examinations that would determine what treatment was needed before they could safely travel. Rebecca remained conscious and alert, despite obvious physical weakness, but the others required more intensive care that reflected the severity of their captivity experience. As evening approached, Sarah found herself in Morrison's office, participating in a conversation that balanced operational necessity with diplomatic protocols that governed interactions between allied military forces. Morrison's questions were carefully phrased to gather information she needed for official reporting, while avoiding details that might create problems for either American or Canadian authorities. "Captain Chen," Morrison said, offering coffee that Sarah accepted gratefully, "I need to file reports about today's emergency landing that will satisfy my superiors without creating diplomatic complications. Can you provide me with enough information to write something that meets administrative requirements?" Sarah had prepared for this conversation during the flight to Cold Lake, developing a narrative that would provide necessary information while protecting classified operational details. "Major, I was conducting a training flight with experimental equipment when we encountered mechanical problems that required emergency landing. The passengers are Air Force personnel who were participating in the training exercise." Morrison nodded, recognizing the careful wording that provided official explanation without revealing sensitive details. "I understand. Training exercises sometimes involve scenarios that can't be discussed in detail. My report will reflect an emergency landing during routine training operations, with medical support provided to personnel who were injured during the incident. The arrangements were professional and diplomatic, allowing both officers to fulfill their responsibilities while protecting information that required classification." Sarah appreciated Morrison's understanding of the complexities involved in military operations that crossed international boundaries during emergency situations. Over the following days, the rescued prisoners received medical treatment that began addressing physical problems that had developed during 3 years of captivity. Rebecca's recovery was faster than the others, reflecting the mental toughness that had sustained her through the ordeal and the physical conditioning that she'd maintained despite limited opportunities for exercise. Sarah spent hours talking with Rebecca about her experience in captivity, learning details about the facility and its operations that hadn't been included in the intelligence reports she'd reviewed before the rescue mission. The installation was apparently one of several similar facilities that were used for housing prisoners, whose capture couldn't be officially acknowledged by any government. "They kept us alive because we had information that was valuable," Rebecca explained during one of their conversations in the Cold Lake Medical Facility. "Technical knowledge about aircraft systems, intelligence about military operations, details about personnel and procedures that they could use for future operations. We were more useful alive than dead, as long as we eventually provided cooperation." The systematic nature of the imprisonment suggested organizational capabilities that extended far beyond the resources of typical terrorist groups or criminal organizations. Rebecca described interrogation techniques that reflected sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure and physical coercion, administered by personnel who appeared to have extensive training in such methods. "Who was running the facility?" Sarah asked. "Did you ever see anyone who seemed to be in overall command?" Rebecca was quiet for several moments, her expression reflecting painful memories that she was reluctant to revisit. There were people there who didn't fit the profile of typical military or intelligence personnel. They spoke multiple languages fluently, had access to information about American operations that should have been highly classified, and seemed to operate with resources that came from sources I couldn't identify. The description suggested involvement by organizations that existed outside normal governmental structures, possibly private military contractors or intelligence groups that operated in the gray areas between official policy and deniable operations. Such entities were known to exist, but rarely acknowledged by governments that found their services useful for situations requiring official distance from controversial activities. As Rebecca's physical condition improved, she began expressing desire to return to active duty, despite the trauma she'd experienced during captivity. Her motivations seemed driven by determination to contribute to operations that would prevent other personnel from experiencing similar imprisonment, combined with professional pride that hadn't been diminished by 3 years of forced inactivity. "I want to fly again," Rebecca told Sarah during their final conversation at Cold Lake. "I know it sounds impossible after what I've been through, but being in that cockpit with you during the rescue reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. There's work that needs to be done, and I want to be part of it." Sarah understood the sentiment while recognizing the challenges that Rebecca would face in returning to operational status. The physical and psychological evaluation required for flight duty would be extensive, potentially taking months or years to complete. The Air Force would need to determine whether Rebecca's experiences had affected her judgment or capabilities in ways that might compromise flight safety. The journey back to Whitmore Air Force Base was arranged through diplomatic channels that allowed the rescued personnel to return to American custody without creating publicity that might compromise ongoing operations. Colonel Patterson coordinated the transfer personally, ensuring that all participants understood the classified nature of their rescue and the importance of maintaining operational security. Rebecca's homecoming was simultaneously joyful and subdued, reflecting the complex emotions associated with return from presumed death, combined with awareness that her experiences couldn't be shared with most of the people who welcomed her back. The squadron gathered to celebrate her survival, while understanding that the circumstances of her rescue would remain classified indefinitely. Sarah watched Rebecca interact with colleagues who had mourned her death for 3 years, noting the subtle changes that captivity had produced despite her friend's determination to resume normal life. Rebecca was more cautious in her responses, more careful about revealing personal information, and more aware of security considerations that had seemed less important before her disappearance. The official debriefing process consumed weeks of interviews with intelligence personnel, who needed to understand everything Rebecca had learned about the facility and its operations. Her information contributed to broader assessments of threats that American personnel faced in disputed territories, while her rescue provided precedents for future operations that might be required to recover other prisoners. 3 months after the rescue, Rebecca was medically cleared for return to limited flight duty, beginning a gradual process of rebuilding the skills and confidence that had made her an exceptional pilot. Sarah served as her wingman during training flights that helped Rebecca readjust to aircraft operations while monitoring her psychological responses to situations that might trigger memories of captivity. Their friendship had been deepened by the rescue experience, creating bonds that extended beyond their shared professional interests. Sarah had risked everything to bring Rebecca home, while Rebecca had maintained hope for rescue during 3 years when such hope seemed irrational. The mutual trust and loyalty they developed provided foundation for renewed partnership that was stronger than their original relationship. Rebecca's modified F-22 was returned to standard configuration and assigned to her permanently, symbolizing the Air Force's confidence in her return to operational status. The aircraft had served its purpose perfectly during the rescue mission, demonstrating capabilities that would influence future modifications to similar systems. Sarah sometimes wondered if the machine had somehow been waiting for exactly the mission that had brought Rebecca home. As spring arrived at Whitmore Air Force Base, Sarah and Rebecca resumed flying together on training missions that gradually increased in complexity and challenge. Rebecca's skills returned steadily, though she remained more cautious than before her captivity experience. The combination of her regained expertise with Sarah's leadership capabilities created a partnership that exceeded their previous effectiveness. The memorial wall where Rebecca's name had been engraved was quietly modified to reflect her return from presumed death, though the official records remained classified to protect ongoing operations. Her survival became an inspiration to other personnel who understood that military service sometimes involved sacrifices that extended far beyond conventional expectations. Sarah's successful rescue mission established her reputation as someone capable of completing assignments that others considered impossible. She was selected for advanced training that would prepare her for future operations requiring similar combinations of technical skill and moral courage. The experience had changed her understanding of what military service could demand and what it could accomplish when personnel were willing to risk everything for their colleagues. Rebecca and Sarah continued flying together, their partnership strengthened by shared experience that had tested their friendship under the most extreme circumstances possible. They never discussed the details of the rescue mission with anyone else, understanding that some stories were too important to share casually. But between themselves, they acknowledged that their bond had been forged in places where hope and determination had proven stronger than captivity and despair. 5 years later, Sarah stood before a new group of rookie pilots at Whitmore Air Force Base, sharing lessons that couldn't be found in any training manual. Rebecca sat in the back of the briefing room, now wearing the silver eagles of a full colonel, her presence a living testament to the bonds that held military families together. Sometimes, Sarah told the young aviators, the most important missions aren't the ones in your official orders. They're the promises you make to the people flying beside you. The rescued prisoners had all returned to productive lives, their experiences classified, but their freedom serving as quiet victory against forces that operated in the shadows. Commander Sullivan commanded a destroyer in the Pacific Fleet. Captain Rodriguez led a counterintelligence unit that prevented other personnel from suffering similar fates. Lieutenant Zhang became a flight surgeon, using his medical skills to keep pilots healthy and mission-ready. Rebecca's aircraft sat in hangar DELTA-7, no longer a memorial but a symbol of perseverance. The nameplate read, Colonel Rebecca Martinez, with a small addition underneath, reserved for those who never give up. As the briefing concluded and the rookie pilots filed out, Sarah and Rebecca walked together toward the flight line where their F-22s waited for another training mission. The memorial wall nearby now included a new inscription, in honor of those who returned from the darkness to guide others home. The Arctic facility had been abandoned shortly after the rescue, its operators vanishing into the same shadows from which they'd emerged. But intelligence networks remained vigilant, knowing that somewhere other Americans might be waiting for someone to remember that no one gets left behind. Rebecca climbed into her cockpit, her movements confident and sure. The scars remained, but they'd become part of her strength rather than sources of weakness. Sarah settled into her own aircraft, ready for whatever challenges their partnership might face. Their radio call echoed across the base as they taxied for takeoff. Tower, this is reserved flight. 2 F-22s ready for departure. Cleared for takeoff, reserved flight. Fly safe. They lifted into the sky together, two pilots who'd learned that some missions never truly end. They just evolve into something greater. Above them, the vast blue held infinite possibilities, and both women knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. The bond forged in that Arctic rescue had become something unbreakable, a partnership that exemplified the very best of military service, loyalty, courage, and the unwavering belief that no one who serves their country will ever be forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.